Hello once again, my friends. Today I'm going to be doing a quick, nothing too fancy ranking of the James Bond movies. I'll be looking at the 25 official films from Eon Productions, plus Never Say Never Again and Casino Royale 67. Since there are so many films in this list, I'm going to be trying to limit myself to a few sentences per entry. And with that, let's begin. And coming in last place, it's Casino Royale 67. This is one of the two feature-length Bond films that exist outside the main series. Producer Charles Feldman got the rights to Fleming's original novel and decided to make it a parody to cash in on the success of the films. But the plot is incoherent and the humor is rarely funny. I classify this as unwatchable. Number 26, Quantum of Solace. The direct sequel to the 2006 version of Casino Royale is also teetering on the brink of unwatchable for me, with an almost incoherent editing style. The choice of Mark Forster as director is a head-scratcher for me, and as I understand it, the film suffered from the 2007 writer's strike. Also, the theme song was one of the very worst in the franchise. I like that the film continued the story of Casino Royale, but found its execution very disappointing. And at number 25, it's Never Say Never Again, Sean Connery's final feature film appearance as James Bond, though outside the main series. It's an unnecessary remake of Thunderball that doesn't improve on the original. There are a few things that I like, but it's a mostly dull affair. I do like the theme song, but the soundtrack from the usually excellent Michel Legrand is terrible. And now on to number 24, Spectre. There are some great action scenes, and I think the theme song is glorious. I like that they brought back Spectre and that Christoph Waltz is playing Blofeld, but the execution of this could have been better, and he just feels wasted in this role. Unlike Skyfall, this one just felt like an unfinished script, and that climax in London felt very underwhelming. Also, the character of C just didn't work for me at all. And just barely squeaking by at number 23, No Time to Die. I don't hate this film as much as some people. I can appreciate that they were trying to do a version of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and this film does have some of the very best and most fun action scenes in the franchise. However, there are a few aspects of the plot that don't quite work for me, including, of course, the ending. You might have noticed that aside from the unofficial films, the bottom three of this list are all Daniel Craig era films, and I do think that that's because those three films just aren't that great, but I also disagree that the franchise was in need of a gritty reboot in the first place. They saw the success of the Bourne Identity and thought that Bond needed to be that. Let Bond be Bond! I much prefer the tone of the Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan films to these. Speaking of Roger Moore, it's The Man with the Golden Gun at number 22. It's just a little underwhelming compared to the other Bond films of the era, but it does benefit from one of the great villains of the franchise, that being Christopher Lee as Francisco Scaramanga. And starting with this film, I would say that I love all of the films left in the countdown, so we've already moved into high quality territory. And Moore's final outing as Bond is my number 21, A View to a Kill. There are some memorable villains, and Moore is terrific as Bond, as always, though I do think this would have been a good one for Timothy Dalton to step in. It's a very by-the-numbers Bond film that doesn't do a lot to shake up the formula. You Only Live Twice comes in at number 20. This was actually the first classic Bond film I ever saw, and it is in every way classic James Bond. As for why it's so low on my list, hard to say. Maybe it's the fact that the series skipped over On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which would have been really great to see with Sean Connery in it, but I do love so many things about this film. Diamonds Are Forever comes in at number 19 on the list. I decided to place this one above You Only Live Twice because it's just so fun. Sure, it may not be anywhere near the best in the series, but you can always count on it for a good campy time. For number 18, I picked Die Another Day. I know this is one of the less popular ones in the series, but once again, I always have a great time with it. Pierce Brosnan has by now perfected his Bond, and there are some terrific action scenes. Yes, there are some questionable choices and some poor CGI at times, but even the Iceland surfing scene doesn't bother me all that much. What does bother me, though, is the theme song by Madonna, which is the only Bond theme that rivals Another Way to Die as the worst in the series for me. And number 17, From Russia with Love. Well, this is starting to get tricky because this film is really, really good, and it shows just what a consistently great franchise this is. From Russia with Love has such a great story, which is unique from the rest of the franchise, which favor Goldfinger as the key creative influence. This one is possibly the best in terms of Cold War spy thriller. My number 16 is The World Is Not Enough. I think this one has a great story, giving Brosnan's Bond his most emotional film. Maybe a little light on the action, but the opening scene is great, and overall the film doesn't have any major issues. Dr. No comes in at number 15. This is the one that started it all, making both Sean Connery and James Bond into household names. An essential Bond film, though it was before the franchise had totally figured itself out. Some aspects, in particular the soundtrack, come off as generic 1950s movie rather than a James Bond film. Moonraker is my number 14. This is another one like Die Another Day or Diamonds Are Forever that some people find too silly, but I always have a great time with it. This is, of course, the one when Bond goes into space, and I wouldn't suggest that it's some great work of cinema, but this is what the Roger Moore era was all about, having a great time in the theater. Thunderball comes in at number 18, and this is one of a similar vein, though to a lesser extent. It was conceived as a bigger and bolder Bond adventure, and I buy it. It's an exciting film with elaborate underwater sequences and a great soundtrack as always from John Barry. Maybe teetering on the edge of campiness, but I'd prefer to call it a brash good time. Live and Let Die coming in at number 12. This one's got a deliberately unique feel to it with Roger Moore as a first-time Bond, a new composer, and a surprising blaxploitation influence. But it's an undoubtedly good time with great action and humor and one of the best theme songs in the series. Number 11, Octopussy. I feel like this is one that people sometimes forget about, but it is one of the most solid and fun Roger Moore adventures. My favorite part of the film is an extensive sequence where Bond races across Germany to stop a nuclear bomb from going off. The tension is palpable as he encounters one challenge after another, and even has to disguise himself as a clown in an iconic moment of the Roger Moore tenure. Tomorrow Never Dies comes in at number 10, and this is a very special one for me because it's the first James Bond film I ever saw. It's an undeniably fun time with an interesting villain, great performances all around, and a terrific soundtrack by David Arnold. On Her Majesty's Secret Service at number 9. This was George Lazenby's only James Bond film, and he does a great job despite Connery being impossible to follow. The story is one of the very best of the James Bond franchise, and I do wish that Sean Connery had been in this one, which might have made it the very best in the series. But Lazenby is great, and so are Diana Rigg and Telly Savalas, plus John Barry contributes one of the top Bond soundtracks. Speaking of Bonds with a short tenure, we haven't mentioned Timothy Dalton's films yet, and License to Kill comes in at number 8 on our list. Financially, the film suffered in a competitive 1989 box office that included Batman and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and I know that some fans aren't too keen on the violence and overall direction of this one, but I love it. This is the 1980s action film of the Bond franchise and features an outstanding one-off soundtrack by Michael Kamen and a brilliant villain performance by Robert Davi. Number 007 For Your Eyes Only. The Roger Moore era films had been going bigger and bigger, but after sending Bond into space in Moonraker, it was time to bring him back down to Earth for a good old-fashioned Bond adventure. Highlights include Bond's final revenge against Blofeld, a highly entertaining chase scene involving a yellow Citroen 2CV, and a terrific soundtrack by Bill Conti. And number 6 on this list is Skyfall. The trend in this franchise is that each actor's first and third films are their defining Bond films, and this is certainly true for Daniel Craig. This film, directed by Sam Mendes, just elevated the franchise in every way. Javier Bardem gave a tremendous performance as the villain Silva, Judi Dench is fantastic in her final major performance as M, and Craig is amazing as always. The film is structurally unlike any Bond film that came before it and remains the highest grossing film in the series. And into the top 5 with The Living Daylights. The first of Timothy Dalton's 2 James Bond films, this one marked a crossroads in the series with Roger Moore passing the torch after 7 films and Pierce Brosnan initially being cast as Bond before a Remington Steele contract forced him to step away. Moneypenny was recast and Bond and Q's relationship took on a new father-son type of dynamic. One of the best scenes is, of course, the sniper scene, which comes straight out of Fleming's short story and shows the first glimpses of Dalton's more serious take on the character. This was also the final Bond film of composer John Barry, who produced one of his best soundtracks. And that brings us to number 4, and from here on in, any of these films are deserving of the number 1 position, but I did place Goldfinger as the number 4. This is the iconic James Bond film and the one which almost every subsequent installment takes the most influence. Sean Connery was at the height of his powers as 007 and gives the definitive performance of the character here. Everything from the soundtrack to the opening credits to the laser torture scene are Bond at his most iconic and transcend the franchise into the highest tier of the cultural zeitgeist. And at number 3, I went with The Spy Who Loved Me. This one has got to be the most important film in the James Bond series because it proved that James Bond was bigger than just Sean Connery. Roger Moore had succeeded in establishing his own humorous take on the character and was undeniably great as James Bond. The film perfectly balanced the fun and seriousness it needed to produce an outstanding Bond experience. Russian agent Anya Armasova is one of the best Bond girls of all time, and Richard Kiel's character Jaws arguably eclipses Oddjob as the best Bond henchman. Shout out also to Marvin Hamlish, whose beloved soundtrack took influences from both classical and disco styles of music. At number 2, it's GoldenEye. Nearly a decade after first being cast as the character, Pierce Brosnan finally had his first James Bond film, and these missing years were cleverly referenced with an opening scene that is set 9 years prior. And boy, is this a great opening sequence, which nicely ties into the film's terrific story about Bond's betrayal by a friend and fellow 00. Trevelyan and Xenia are among the best villains in the franchise and are only 2 of the great characters in this film. I think the only thing that keeps this from being number 1 is that some aspects of the soundtrack don't seem to be the best fit. However, the director Martin Campbell would get one more crack at it 11 years later. And that film is our number 1 James Bond movie, Casino Royale. After 53 years, the main series finally adapted Ian Fleming's original novel, though it was in fact the 3rd screen adaptation of Casino Royale. First of all, the cast is outstanding from top to bottom. Daniel Craig exceeded all expectations as James Bond, going overnight from being the most hated Bond actor to being considered the best ever by many fans. Mads Mikkelsen gave one of the best Bond villain performances of all time. Ava Green was tremendous as Vesper Lynd, and we could go on and on. And the action sequences are some of the very best of the franchise. Every single one is so captivating and brilliantly executed. The story obviously is terrific because it's based on one of the best Bond books, and the soundtrack also is outstanding from David Arnold, making this a perfect Bond film. So that's my completed ranking of the James Bond movies. Kind of amazing that Casino Royale is at both the top and bottom of this list. I'm curious to see what the franchise has to offer next, and as of this writing, there is a degree of ambiguity in its future. I would love to see a return to the more fun styles of Connery, Moore, and Brosnan, but I want to know what you guys think, so do be sure to let me know your ranking in the comments down below. And be sure to hit like and subscribe for more content on James Bond, Indiana Jones, and more. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I wish you all fortune and glory. Bye-bye now.